The last item of interest we want to spend a bit more time on is, of course, local profiling, because just like on the AirOS, that is something that you probably want to set up and enable because it gives you that first nice visibility on what type of device you have in your system, but also it gives you this flexibility to create different profiles, different policies, depending on what type of device you see associating to your network. So to configure local profiling, you go to Configuration and then Security. And on the right, there is this local policies. But before going there, there is the access control list that I want to show you. And that's because you can create ACLs just like you do on switches and routers. And you can decide here of what you want to allow. And the reason why I'm showing you this is because the way you create local profiling is slightly different here than on AirOS. So let me create a very basic access control list that allows everything. Just so you know, we have one ACL. Once we have that one, that's the first step, deciding what you want your users to have access to. If you want to restrict this access, of course here I'm not restricting anything, so that IPv4 access control list is not mandatory and not very useful. But let's suppose you want to create that rule to allow some access to some things and forbid it to some others. So the first step is to create the ACL, and then the next step is to go to local policies and then service templates. Service template is where you're going to link your permissions to a VLAN. So you create a new service template and decide what VLAN people should be in when the service template is applied. So let's say I want to send people in my policy to VLAN 23. This is also where you set the session timeout. This is also where you can call your policy, your ACL. And this is also where you can set a specific egress or ingress QoS policy, for example, an AVC profile. So you see, all this is defined here at the service template instead of being defined directly in the profiling like we do in AirOS. And once I have that, I need to go through a third step. And that third step is what we call the policy map, which is just below service template. And what policy map does, it simply calls the service templates. And the reason why we do this is because the SSID is going to be linked to the policy map, not to the service template. So you create the policy map, that's one extra step basically. And inside your policy map, this is also where you're going to decide what type of device you want to apply this policy to. So you see, for example, device type, and you have a long list, the usual long list of devices. And for example, I'm going to call the Android one. And there, my policy map is going to be tied to the service template. So on iOS XE, that's how you do it. You create a service template, which is basically the resulting policy with the access list, the QoS, etc. And then in the policy map, you decide what kind of device you want to apply this policy to. So I'm applying it to Android, but you see I could also add some others, just like I did on AirOS. I could also apply the same policy to Apple devices, etc. Once I have it working fine, I go back to wireless, WLANs, I pick up my SSID. I first have to check device classification. That's how I enable this profiling. And then if I click here, I'm going to call the policy I want to use, for example, the one I just created, my profile policy. That's how you use local profiling. Of course, if you're using local profiling, not something that is done on the ICE server, you also have to check below local HTTP profiling if it's a WebAuth type of SSID. If it's not a WebAuth type of SSID, you don't need to do anything because the fact that you create the profiling policy is going to tell the controller that you have to look for the DHCP request, etc. If it's a WebAuth type of SSID, you may also want to look at the HTTP request, and that's where you would check this local HTTP profiling. As usual, if it's something that happens on Radius, on the ICE server, because it's WebAuth and you use central web authentication, then only then you would check the Radius HTTP profiling. But you do not check both local and Radius, it's either or, of course, and you use HTTP profiling only if it's a WebAuth type of SSID. So I expect that you would enable profiling because even if you don't want to apply any specific policy to your devices, the simple fact that you can have this visibility on which device is accessing the network is something which is very useful for your management.